planning the theme for the INA for this year, centering on the topic of America's spirit, dreams, myths, and reality, our committee thought it especially appropriate to dedicate the Institute to a faculty member who, in so many ways, embodies the best in the American spirit, Professor Edward Allen. Professor Wayne Osborne of the Department of History has expressed in the dedication, much more eloquently than I can, our appreciation of what Professor Allen has stood for and carried into action through his long lifetime of service, and continues. My first awareness of Edward Allen occurred in 1946 when I arrived on this campus, when a colleague pointed him out to me and remarked, "He's a socialist, you know." I wasn't sure whether I was supposed to approve or keep my distance. To this day, I do not know whether or not Edward is a socialist, but I do know that he has integrated into his life all three of the headings of myth, dreams, and reality. Myth it can refer to a number of things, but it can refer to any recurring theme that appeals to the consciousness of a people by embodying its cultural ideals or by giving expression to deep, commonly felt emotions. The Bill of Rights, for example, is in written form, gives shape to these cultural ideals. Certainly Edward Allen, a lifelong, active, civil libertarian, has brought to life these ideals, those ideals incorporated in the guarantees of this very remarkable document. Under the heading of dreams, most Americans have a deep-seated, I think, commitment to peace, despite their straying at times from this ideal. Edward Allen has dreamed of world peace, has never strayed from that dream, and has actively worked for peace and world understanding. This is demonstrated by his personal involvement with peace movements, his opposition to the ill-fated adventurism in Vietnam, and his long support for such things on campus as the Cosmopolitan Club, whose aim, the Cosmopolitan Club, is to promote international understanding and goodwill between American and foreign students. As for reality, Edward Allen has never blinded himself to the ugly realities of life. On the contrary, he has tried in his quiet but very steadfast way to alleviate misery and to secure justice. He has never given way to cynicism. Several years ago, when Scott Nearing, the venerated environmentalist, lectured here, Professor Hodges, our staff, took a picture of Allen and Nearing, two nonagenarians in very animated conversation, a picture I cherish very much, for it assured me that with men like these, after such long lives, we're still not defeated, we're still optimistic, and there was still room for lesser men to hope. To paraphrase Lee Hunt's Abu Ben Adam, may Edward Allen's tribe increase, for he is one that loves his fellow men. Edward Allen, would you please stand up?
Good evening. I'm Megan Berryhill. I'm happy to welcome you all to the 16th Annual Institute on National Affairs. Before I go on further, I'd like to say a word about tomorrow's scheduled events. At noon, in the Pioneer Room, will be a film, The Protestant Spirit, USA. At 3 o'clock, Gerald Bauer will speak on the religious and philosophical background of the American spirit. And at 8 o'clock in the evening, Michael Kamen will speak on Tradition versus Democracy in American Culture, a Transformation of National Values. We begin our institute with a person described as an author, historian, journalist, researcher, and reporter. As a 1962 graduate of Radcliffe in U.S. and Mideast history, she began writing for magazines such as The New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, among others. Her experience in and knowledge of volatile areas of the world has made her an authority on not only American but international politics. After winning the Pulitzer for her account of the Vietnam War in Fire in the Lake, she recently published an expose of American textbooks, appropriately titled America Revised. I'm honored to introduce to you tonight Frances Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and I'm proud to be asked to be a keynote speaker in the forum which will continue on with so many luminaries over the week. As it happens, I've just been visiting a version of the American dream. It's called, well, let's call it Fun City, Florida. It's a retirement community that rises right out of the middle of the countryside. Something of a surreal vision, actually, because you drive through endless swamps, and swamps with these sort of real mean-looking cattle trying to snatch at grass but underneath the palmettos, and past a whole lot of very raunchy bars, when you suddenly see a perfect little suburb with white houses and green lawns and golf courses, all perfectly manicured. And the people who live there are all retired professional people and businessmen who've come from the Midwest and the Northeast, and who, as one discovers, represent a very, very narrow band on the spectrum of American society. They are, all of them, all 8,000 of them who live there, people over 60, and they've chosen to settle there out in the back of beyond. Did they jump, or were they pushed? That's the question, and it's not an answerable one, since they will tell you simply that they chose to go there. They chose to take up a new life in Florida. Well, the pastor of the biggest Protestant church there was a man of great intelligence and social concerns, which ranged beyond his community to the much poorer Floridians who live in the countryside around this rather privileged golfing camp. Told me that he tells newcomers to this retirement community that they're like pilgrims setting off for America, that they're all in the same boat and they're starting a new life together. Well, this image of the pilgrims is a rather powerful one. Of course, it's the myth, if you will, of the origins of American society, and at the same time a kind of dream of the future. The image suggests a lot of very deeply rooted American ideas about self, about who we are and what role we play in the world. What it suggests is a number of very traditional ideas about this country, that the idea that we are a classless society, that we are a community, a brotherhood, but also people who have sort of uniform values, that we are idealistic, that we're motivated essentially by idealism, that we can escape from history, personal and social, with all of the corruptions that history entails, that we can, as it were, become born again and take on the task of perfecting ourselves. It also contains the idea of American exceptionalism, that we are a chosen people who can escape the usual historical path and mold for other societies. It also contains the idea that there's a kind of endless frontier of man against nature and man against infinite nature. Well, that pastor adopted the image of the pilgrims in the boat because of his own intellectual history, but also with a motive, a rather practical one, of persuading the retirees that adaptation to their new life meant an abandonment of the past, and specifically an abandonment of the roles they used to play at work or in the communities they left behind. You must forget, he might add, that to the retirees, that you were a Bell Telephone executive because you're not one any longer. And it's not going to make you any friends here if you go talk endlessly about it. And of course, the pastor isn't the only one that promotes this notion to this community. Various people who are sort of social directors and that kind of thing do so in other words. And so do people who live there. These retirees say, and I believe they believe that what you did doesn't matter a hang to anyone here, it's what you are now. At the same time, of course, this Fun City telephone directory, it's actually an official membership directory, lists people's former professions, along with their current names and addresses, and phone numbers. And people in Fun City talk endlessly about how interesting their own careers were, and so were everyone else's. That's what part of the reason that attracted them to come there. And for 10 years, the community has excluded from its golf courses and swimming pools the members of another retirement community right across the street, whose members are not as well off as they are, and who have come from lower status professions. Well, I mean, in some sense, Fun Cityans believe that they are all equal, that they are all in the same boat, while in practice they make the most infinitesimal kinds of social distinctions and exclusionary rules. They're like bird watchers, in a sense, who can not only distinguish between a swallow and a wren, but can distinguish between dozens of varieties of warblers. Well, Alexis de Tocqueville, a great French journalist, if you want, and historian who came to this country in the 1830s, and would have understood this very well. After visiting this country, he wrote, "Well, in democracies where the members of the community never differ much one from each other and naturally stand so near that they may at any time be fused into one general mass, numerous artificial and arbitrary distinctions spring up, by means of which every man hopes to keep himself aloof, lest he should be carried away against his will into the crowd. This can never fail to be the case, for human institutions can be changed, but man cannot. Whatever may be the general endeavor of a community to render its members equal and alike, the personal pride of individuals will always see to it that to rise above the line and to form somewhere an inequality to their own advantage." Well, but de Tocqueville was a European with a tragic view of history and human nature. And the pastor shared his vision in the sense that he knew perfectly well about the kinds of arbitrary distinctions that were made inside this community. He described them to me. But at the same time, he really also believed in his own vision of the world. I think that if you pressed him, he would say that he was delivering this sermon to newcomers for an efficient purpose, to persuade Sun Cityans that they had to get along. Well, in thinking about this image that he used and these ideas which come out of it, the problem is not simply how much they match up against reality, but since they have a moral as well as a practical dimension, what is their utility as ideals? Think about it for a moment in the context of this particular retirement community. The image of the pilgrims setting off on their small boats is a heroic one, and adjusting to retirement in this community often demands a good deal of heroism. On the other hand, this particular prescription to be like the pilgrims is somewhat problematic because it implies a kind of rootlessness, also a kind of selfishness. I mean, leaving the rest of the world behind unreformed to set off by oneself alone on this boat. And it's ahistorical in a sense to the point of lobotomy. It's perhaps also very destructive of the individual identity. Looked at this way, these retirees might have been right to reject it, or at least to reject it in part, because they were asked to construct a new life, but they had, after all, already lived one life, and why should they abandon that one? Well, history is often thought of as an arrangement of facts, but history and poetry share a single muse, Clio, and for good reason, because the way people comprehend their past and their present condition is most often and most completely through imagery and metaphor. Most of us are probably not conscious of most of the images we ourselves use to understand our society and its place in the world. Often we acquire these images unconsciously. I only recently realized that I conceived of the year in the form of a wheel, with winter at the bottom. And yet for that very reason, because of this sort of unconscious process, these images have terrific power. They can be useful in organizing one's thinking. They are always useful in that way, but they can be useful in terms of one's adaptation to the world one lives in. Or they can be very destructive. Or they can be of ambiguous value, such as I think that this pastor's metaphor was for the people of Sun City. For the intellectual historian or the journalist like myself, of course, the problem is to discover what these images are, these myths, if you want, these dreams. And the task is a difficult one because, of course, we're a vast and various people, but also because we live nowadays amidst this barrage of information coming from all sides. Also because our ideas and our conceptions of the society change a great deal over time. How is it possible to discover when a new idea becomes a form of conventional wisdom? Well, electoral statistics and polls can't help us very much at all in this way. And so one way I conceived of was reading U.S. history textbooks for school children. The current U.S. history texts are rather short on poetry, but they nonetheless have to encapsulate American history. There's an act of compression there, and that very act of compression requires a certain degree of metaphor. Well, the first textbooks I went to when I started to make this search was the ones that I grew up with myself, the textbooks of the 50s. And when I started going through the shelves of them in the Columbia University Library, I began to think of them as these archaeological deposits, I mean, ruins of a civilization that had long gone. I think the easiest way to describe what's in them very briefly and to make some kind of contrast between the texts of the 50s and the texts of today, again for the purpose of showing you to what extent these images of American society change and to what extent there are sort of permanent elements in it. I think that the easiest way is to read an imitation I did of a burlesque that was done in the 1890s, actually, by the New England Historical Association on the texts of that period. And the New England History Association put their burlesque in the form of advice to a prospective textbook writer of the period. So this is what my advice would be to a textbook writer of the 1950s. First of all, give a panoramic view of the country as if you were flying over it in an airplane, drawing a picture of agricultural plenty and technological magnificence. Say nothing about the Indians. Give a short history of Europe, showing that the most important achievement of the Europeans was leaving Europe to come here. Glorify Columbus, but then explain how the gold-crazed Spanish descended into depravity for lack of a free enterprise system. Dwell on the hardships of the Puritans and the growth of the colonial economy. Follow John Adams and General Washington through the Revolution, and then put the text of the Constitution with all of its amendments into the next chapter and describe it as one of the greatest products of the human mind. Skim quickly over the War of 1812 and go back to your major theme of a developing economy. Explain the events leading up to the Civil War in textbook deadpan, and then lavish all the adjectives you saved up from the readability formula on the horrors of Reconstruction for the white Southern gentry. Talk about the plight of ignorant, gullible Negroes under the rule of the carpetbaggers and scalawags, and then, apart from a paragraph on Booker T. Washington, say no more about the Negroes for the rest of U.S. history. Describe the wonders of the Industrial Revolution. Make much of the captains of industry, and spend so many words on their charitable activities that readers will suppose that they gave most of their money away. Describe the immigration of poor, tired, and hungry Europeans to this land of plenty, and make a list of second-generation artists, including Lily Pons and Irving Berlin, and then state that they made contributions to the United States. Make much of the progressive era reforms, particularly the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the growth of unions, but do not, for heaven's sakes, explain why the reforms or the unions appeared to be necessary at the time. Drop the subject of social reform, also the subsequent history of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and give over the rest of the book to the growth of American power in the world and the Cold War. If you're feeling good, you can end with a quote from an Eisenhower inaugural address. If you're feeling bad, remind children of the horrid might of the Soviet Union and suggest they report any subversives in their class to the FBI. I literally found that in one text. Yeah. Well, there's a good deal of contrast between those texts of the 50s and those of the late 1970s. The most obvious point of contrast is that the newer texts are far, far more beautiful. The 50s text looks sort of like strange socialist realist objects. These ones are glamorous and gorgeous. I mean, Madison Avenue, but more than that, it's the Madison Avenue art galleries, not the advertising agencies that are involved. Enormous numbers of graphics, a great deal of reproduction of American painting, from colonial painting up to Jackson Pollock. Around this terrific art gallery that these books are, the text goes in little ant trails around the side. And one might conclude we've become a rather less literate and more aesthetic civilization since then. There's an interesting point of contrast in describing American origins, because the texts of the 50s begin with Columbus, then go backwards into European history, and then forward from Columbus again. In the texts of the 70s, the first people described are Native Americans. And again, a lot of Native American art, some description of Native American cultures. Then we go to the Vikings, and then Columbus sort of trails along somewhere in the middle. There's really almost no European history involved, and the colonial chapters on colonial America have been collapsed into a very short form. And from this, one might understand that the United States is an American power in the continental sense, and that in a way it has sort of no dependency on Europe at all. This is true and not true as you go along in these books, because we continue with the European settlers. The Native Americans drop out quite soon, and it is, as it were, the history of Cortez and not Montezuma. The we involved are in fact, the European settlers, and the we is also at this point confined to what is now the territorial boundaries of the United States, and that the fact that there is a continuing relationship with Mexico and Canada only appears in fits and starts. There is no never, and there never has been any acknowledgement that at the time of Jefferson, the great German scientist Alexander von Humboldt said that the great scientific center in the Western Hemisphere was Mexico City, where 300, at that same time, 300 poets were competing for prizes. At the same time, Mexico is made to look at the end of these books like somehow like a new country all of a sudden. For example, in many of these books, perhaps this has disappeared by now, but there are great pictures of Cesar Chavez and heroic portraits and explanations about the Farm Workers Union, but one had no idea where Chavez came from. It just sort of popped up, you know. So the United States is still pictured in a way as a totally isolated in the world. Isolated on the continent and isolated as far as the other continents are concerned. Well, there's been a good deal of change in these books about in the description of American society. In the 1950s, these books had simply no black or brown faces in them at all, unless it was George Washington Carver. And it was the general conventional wisdom was that the United States was a melting pot, but a melting pot which had melted towards some sort of common, somewhat Anglo-Saxon base. It was not too clear. Well, the texts of the 70s are very, very different. Indeed, they say very specifically that there is no such thing as a melting pot in this country. I remember one fifth-grade U.S. history book said in one of its earliest passages that we haven't got a melting pot, we have a salad. I think the whole thing became rather hard on the stomach. But there is enormous concentration on different European groups that have come to this country. There's a description of German Americans, Italian Americans, Greek Americans, and so on. This emphasis on ethnicity is very important. And the question is, you know, how it got there, and how it got there is an interesting question, because it did not do so via scholars such as Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who've pointed out, indeed, that the melting pot really never existed in the great northeastern cities, for sure. But it got there via politics. It got these ethnic groups arrived in the textbooks via the Black Civil Rights Movement. And of course, the treatment of blacks in this country is probably the major change in the textbooks. In the 1950s, Samuel Eliot Morison, the great Harvard historian, said that he thought it was quite impossible to change people's popular notions about Reconstruction. Historians had changed theirs in the 1920s and 30s, but into the 50s, and indeed right through the rebellion of the civil rights movement, Reconstruction was pictured in these books as from the position of the white Southern gentry. There was no acknowledgement that I mean, when they said Southerners, they meant white Southerners. Simple as that. Well, the civil rights movement had a very direct and appreciable impact on the text, because school boards in cities like Newark and Detroit, which were gaining a black majority and also a terrific consciousness of such things, actually raised hell with publishers and said, we can't use these racist texts in our schools any longer. You go back and rewrite them. And rewrite them they did. And finally, this spread out and became the national textbook. the national textbook whose new orthodoxy was that we live in a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. So in the 70s, you see this notion of the uniformity of American society was completely broke down. But what was interesting about it, that while this uniformity in the sense of ethnicity and so on broke down, that something else remained much the same as it was. That is to say, the changes in the textbooks in this regard were brought about by power, by political power. But ironically, it was that power itself that never got into the textbooks. These histories mentioned the civil rights movement. Surely they did. But they never mentioned the connection between the civil rights movement and the failure of Reconstruction. They also never went into the kind of struggles that it took black people in the South and in the North and many others to really change our perception of faces in it, many faces of various sorts in it, that most of the black faces you see are at mayoral conferences, or they are people in lab coats. You do not see a sign of anyone who's poor in this country, of any color. Everybody is terribly upward mobile and achieving, and again, rather uniform in this new respect. Well, why do this? Why avoid this political struggle? Well, of course, nobody wants to be reminded of the bad old days, of the days of overt racism. That's one reason. But running back through if you look back at the textbooks of earlier periods, you'll see that there's another rather profound strain, which I believe is important here, and that is the notion that that the United States is a consensus society. American society may not be uniform, but at least we all somehow always get along together. There is no sense of conflict, which might have winners and losers, of irreconcilable differences between people. There's no sense of tragedy, ever. And, I mean, you can go into detail, which I won't here, but what happened to the Wobblies? You never find out from the textbooks. You don't have a sense that people were ever really engaged in a political struggle of any sort. You have no sense of class differences at all, ever. And it's here where I think that Americans often seem so sort of naive to Europeans. Europeans who do not deny at least the past of class difference, and who cannot but acknowledge as a result of their histories that there are some differences which are more or less permanent and unbridgeable. Well, take the subject of foreign policy. In the 1950s, the American view of, at least post-World War II, foreign policy was extremely clear and simple. There was a worldwide ideological struggle between communism, which had no nationality in these books, and the free world, of which the United States was the leader. In one of them, there's a map which countries are colored in as being free or communist or neutral in between somehow. And it looks as though they're going to be permanently that way, all of them. There's also a subtext in these books underneath this struggle, which becomes stronger as in the 1960s, which is the struggle, the United States struggle for world peace through the United Nations, through the Peace Corps, through American attempts to help the developing world. The textbooks, of course, mention a lot of facts which don't really fit into either one of these schema, which appear to be the double and only motivations of American foreign policy. They mention the Sino-Soviet split. They mention the Arab-Israeli struggles and U.S. intervention in the Middle East in various ways. They mention various American initiatives vis-à-vis the oil-producing countries, Iran, and so on. But they leave these facts kind of dangling there, unanchored to any description. The motivations are simply these two. And you find, I think, that if you look at the books of the late 70s, that apart from the period of the Vietnam War, that is until the end of the Vietnam War, where there was a lot of commotion about what is going on there in the last sections of these books, that foreign policy is the area in which these books have changed the least. There are a much larger and more puzzling group of little facts, little exceptions, without really rules to guide them. But I think underneath you'll see this, that there are still these sort of double two images of the world. This struggle of communism versus freedom, and the U.S. struggle for world peace. It's a kind of debate between Manichaeans and Gnostics, if you will. And in both cases, there's a total refusal to acknowledge that anybody has any national interest. The Manichaean part of it has a demonology. The Gnostic part of it managed to transcend these interests entirely. Neither admit that the United States is a great power with great strategic and economic interests, and that the same is true of the Soviet Union. And that some of these interests can be reconciled while others can't. I have to add at the moment that these Gnostic Manichaean tendencies don't seem to be confined to textbooks. They certainly show up in the American reaction to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and also to the military crackdown in Poland. Neither event was anything of a surprise. And yet the reaction of American government officials in both cases seemed to be one of total disbelief. After the invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter said words to the effect that he didn't realize that the Russians could be such terrible people. He'd found some demon out there. The policy reaction was to suspend grain sales to the Soviet Union, a sort of protest which had absolutely no effect whatsoever. And indeed was, nobody, I suppose, really imagined that it would. And of course, the Reagan administration, coming to power, suspends this ban on grain sales with no quid pro quo from the Russians at all. And then, of course, along comes the Polish crisis, and the Reagan administration throws the same rhetorical tantrum. It suspends Aeroflot services, it suspends licenses for the export of certain kind of technology, and it suspends the arms control talks in Europe. All of which measures are, again, wholly ineffective. They're sort of like going up to the border and waving one's hands, you know. They're completely puzzling to Europeans, completely puzzling. And the only way the Europeans have of explaining it is that they're meant merely for domestic U.S. consumption. To give an illusion of doing something when in fact you can't do anything short of something that you really can't do, like invade Poland or whatever, or Afghanistan. But if this is indeed a sort of political ploy, of the administration or both administrations vis-à-vis the American public, they must believe we're pretty dumb indeed, and that the United States really knows nothing about the realities of power and can't understand the real tragedy of both situations. Again, they must imagine that we can't recognize that for the U.S. and for the Soviet Union there are certain national interest priorities. The Reagan administration differs from the Carter administration in that it doesn't believe that arms control is one of these priorities, but it clearly believes in the survival of the international banking system. Well, what we have here, again, the realm of policy as well as the realm of textbooks, is the survival of this American this myth of American idealism, that we have only idealistic concerns, and of, in a strange way, that we remain isolated in the world. Well, if you look at go back to these textbooks, if you try and do an analysis of style on them, you realize something quite general about them. First of all, there are no conflicts in these textbooks that are described, not even really the conflict of the Civil War. I mean, of course, we hear about the causes of the Civil War and a tiny bit about the fighting, not very much anymore. They don't like military history in the current text. But the causes of the war are described in the fashion that you would imagine that if only somebody had sat down at a green baize table and got the shape of the table right, that everything would have been easily resolved between reasonable people. No. Again, there's no sense of the real tragedy of that conflict. Instead of conflicts, what you have, and this is true throughout, is problems. Problem is an interesting word because, as somebody pointed out to me the other day, it's quite different from predicament. And problems have solutions. They're like math problems, have solutions. Predicaments are ones that are real, can't be solved in a way that will be totally satisfactory. There are problems in these texts. These books are filled with passive verbs. They're to the point where there are very few actors in them. I mean, one of my favorite sentences is, some nuclear weapons have to be carried on airplanes, whereas others can travel by themselves. In trying to talk about the Vietnam War, they can provide no explanation for its causes, and or indeed for the reason it went on for so long, or indeed why it stopped. And their account of it is simply, well, it started, and then it went on and on and on, and then it stopped. I mean, it's kind of this crabgrass. And I mean, if you had to decide what their theory of history was, you'd have to say that it's sort of a natural disaster theory. I mean, things kind of happen, and then everyone tries to rush in and pick up the pieces and all get together and do the best we can. Well, there's a reason for this, of course, too. This incredible apoliticism, which is in the text, and this avoidance of conflict. It's a desire not to offend any group, for sure, but it's also a part of a pedagogical theory that's been around in the public secondary school systems really since around 1910. It's the result of it's a result of compromise between the progressive educators of the period and what one might call more scientific historians whose names end up on the tops of these books. But the progressive educators, the ones who really were, I mean, in the sense of historically progressive, who were the ones responsible for founding the secondary school system in this country, they had a very definite theory about the world and theory about what the purpose of education was. They wanted to promote certain kinds of behavior in kids. They were interested in good citizenship. They were interested in social action for the common good. They were being progressives. Indeed, they were rather. They believed in tolerance. They believed in communities, and a lot of nice things. But the means they chose was simply to change histories and to find these virtues which they themselves espoused in every American historical personage that had ever existed. From the founding fathers on. I mean, all of a sudden, Hamilton becomes this nice, tolerant, generous, outgoing person in those books.